This is Revolving Door Syndrome, and I'm Dr. Nina Su. One of the biggest challenges facing us in the 21st century is significant demographic change. We have an ageing population with people living much longer and with fewer children being born. This is resulting in a growing use of immigration to provide the economic activity to fund core public services like health, education, and justice. Meanwhile, growing income inequality is contributing to worse rates of preventable illness as health funding is diverted away from interventions that actually keep people healthy. It's time we take a much longer-term view to the social and economic challenges our country will face, much longer than the 3-year election cycle. To talk further about this issue, I bring you the economist Shamubeel Eaqub. For New Zealand and our people to find success, we need to be realistic, but hopeful to get through tough times. Whether we like it or not, New Zealand will undergo significant change. And with that, we must be truthful and open about the risks associated with this change. What is at stake here is social cohesion. If we continue to become more divided, we risk losing the prosperity, freedom, and progress that has been hard fought for by generations that came before us. But if we can find a sense of common ground, collective identity, and a shared vision and set of values, maybe, just maybe, we will change the trajectory to a better future for all to thrive. And while you listen to this episode, I want you to really ask yourself, what does it mean to be a New Zealander? Send us an email, DM, or a voice note to our social media to let me know what you think. So Shamubeel, you're an economist. Could you, in just a few sentences, give the best economic argument for a public health approach to government and the health system?
Well, public health just means doing it the right way.
But what is the right way?
The right way means dealing with problems before they become a problem. It's about making an investment in the things that will prevent future problems, right? And so much of what we do in life is about preparation for the future. It's not a guarantee, but it's about being prepared. So like we do by educating ourselves or learning how to cross the road, those are preparations. They don't stop everything from happening, but they stop most of the bad things from happening.
So, when people get financial advice just on their own personal finances, people say, sometimes you need to invest up front so that you get better returns later on. Right. I'm not certain that's what's happening in our sort of health system or wider society. So now can you give me the best argument for doing what we're doing now, which seems to be the opposite of a public health approach?
Yeah, look, I think we do some public health, but not a lot of it relative to how much is needed. And the political requirement is you need to be seen when you're sick. You need to be looked after when you're sick. So quite often public policy deals with the problem of and. How do you do both things that are important? What we see in terms of health, in terms of the GPs, the EDs, the hospitals, is the end of all the problems accumulating, right? It's the acute end of health. All the other bits, the public health part, those are the things that you do well beforehand around nutrition, around activity, sport, that will prevent big problems in the future. The political problem, I think, is public health is invest now, benefits later. In health, in the acute health, there is a need right now, look after that. And so we prioritize that because politically, having a wait list in health, having people not being able to access medicines or care is politically far more damaging than kids getting bad nutrition or people not being active, people being obese or overweight. All those things are just kind of problems of the future and somebody else's problem, not the lot who are in Beehive today.
So I feel like different economists have different ideas about this, right? I don't think every single economist says what you've been saying. So when economists get together, what are they saying that's not that?
I don't hang out with economists. They're not interesting people, to be honest. No, I really don't. My friends are not generally a lot of other economists. I have some friends who are economists. But also, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think if you take a rational approach, it is about doing both of those things. So in my mind anyway, health and public health are two parts of the same coin. One is the upfront regular investment part, and the other is I have had an emergency, I need to draw down on my savings. The problem is because we are not doing so much of the public health, there is so much demand and need for acute health. All our energy goes into that thing. So I don't know if there will be a huge amount of pushback from economists in general who think about things rationally, that public health makes sense. In fact, public health is a big part of where the economics and health overlap.
So, the healthcare spending keeps going up, right?
Yep.
Sometimes it's, with inflation and population growth, sometimes not. But the rule of it is that our healthcare expenditure is going up, right? What are the impacts of changing demographics, right? We talk about, people talk about things like aging population. I've come to realize, actually a lot of people are taking longer to enter the workforce because a lot of people are going for a tertiary education. And also there's less children being born. How big is this problem?
Well, there's a few different things going on, right? One is around just the size of our population, which is getting bigger. So there's more people. Mm-hmm. The amount of need that we have in our community is increasing because generally when you're very young and when you're very old, that's when your healthcare costs are the highest. And also, I think as a society, we're getting sicker. So we're much more likely to be obese, much more likely to be overweight, much more likely to have diabetes, much more likely to have anxiety and mental health issues. So as a result, we're going to see the total quantum of health demand increase a lot more than population growth in the future. The difficulty for us is not only are we going to see this increase in demand, but we're going to have fewer people paying taxes. So most taxes in New Zealand are paid between the ages of 30 and 64. That's when you pay bulk of your taxes. We're going to be running out of those people.
I mean, how big is this problem of there not being enough working age people? I think I saw something about it at the moment. We have about 10 to 1. And then I think in a couple of decades, it's down to 6 to 1.
Yeah, so the way I kind of visualize it is we've probably got more workers as a share of the population today than we'll ever have, ever again. So pretty much from this year on, we're going to have more people reaching retirement age than those people who are entering the workforce. So more going out than coming in. And as a result, we're going to always have fewer and fewer people coming through. But it doesn't mean that's exactly what's going to be the problem, because we know that older people are likely to work for longer, some because they can and some because they must. They're too poor, they haven't got enough savings, they don't own their own home, and as a result, they have to keep working to be able to afford to live. But also what we know is that New Zealand has one kind of potential policy tool to help us, which is immigration. So, immigration is a very political issue. It kind of goes up and down a lot, but we can kind of smooth out our aging population with bringing in more people. It's not a perfect solution because the quantum is just too big. But for New Zealand, it's an issue of a gradual demographic rising of the tide of more and more older people, fewer and fewer taxpayers. So you've got this problem of more demands on health, more demands on superannuation, more demand on housing subsidies, and fewer people paying taxes. And, our whole tax system and promises to future generations is a Ponzi scheme.
Well, I mean, I saw you write down in one of your articles about how superannuation payments are remaining indexed to wages, showing the inequitable way our welfare system treats universal superannuation for over 65s compared to those living in poverty. And in parenthesis, you also said that they never paid enough taxes to fund future superannuation payments. They are paid out of current taxes. So I guess what you're saying there is our retirement age people, they paid the taxes to look after the people who were retirement age when they were working age.
That's correct.
But they weren't actually paying for their retirement.
That's right. So New Zealand has what we call a pay-as-you-go system, not as a save-as-you-go system. So we only pay for the people who are drawing on those superannuation at the current time. There is a misconception, I think, amongst New Zealanders that when you pay taxes, you're paying for the promises that you've made to your future self. That when I'm retired, I'm going to get super and that's going to come out of the taxes I've paid today. It's not true. It's not true. So if that is the case, then you should be really, really aware that it's possible that in the future we will ration who gets superannuation. Universalism is wonderful, if you can afford it. So New Zealanders want to have low taxes and high benefits.
But I think a lot of people who are sort of nearing retirement age, so let's say people who are in their 50s, let's say, are probably saving enough so that they can top up universal superannuation. So what's going to happen if we say take away superannuation or like universal superannuation in the future, right? Because we can't just let a whole population of people go into abject poverty.
Well, that is the alternative. If you don't do it gradually and proactively over time, at some point in time, it will break. The dam will break, right? And the reason I say the dam will break is at some point in time, you're not going to have the old people being the dominant taxpayers. So over the course of the next 20 years, all of the taxes from work, from wages, will be used up by super and health. All of it. And
so
what?
By that you mean there's not much left over for roads and education.
Education for our kids. So what we're going to say is that, so you should go and work and you should pay taxes, and all those taxes will be paid for older people who never save for their retirement, never save for their older age. And do you think that's going to be politically palatable when there is a situation at some point in time in the next 20 to 30 years when all of the taxes from work are going to pay for essentially keeping older people in comfort, relative comfort, while we neglect other things?
I mean, how do we reconcile the need to look after our elderly, but also look after our young? I mean, before we started recording, we were talking about your own family and your own father who had a stroke as well. You know, it's not inevitable that old people will get a stroke. It's not inevitable that they will get a heart attack. But we know that as people get older, age is an independent factor in getting, you know, cardiovascular disease or strokes, you know. So it's all well and good for us to say, oh, you know, old people didn't pay enough taxes into the healthcare system, into superannuation. But when it's your own parent, when it's yourself, you know, how do we reconcile that feeling of need to look after our young people, but also our old people?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's entirely reconcilable because it's always about and. How do we do both of these things, and what sacrifices and trade-offs are willing to make that happen? And so when I think about it, of course, at an individual level, when you have an emergency, you want the care to be available, but we can't make it available if we don't look after it. And what I mean by that is, at the moment, we are running our health system pretty ragged. Right? It's been underfunded for a long time.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, and as you know from your own individual personal experience, right? And I think to me the challenge is there's always going to be this amount of demand for health services, and it's a really hard one, right? Because we want to look after people when they're sick. Where do you draw the boundary? How much is too much and how much is not enough?
So what you're talking about is trade-offs, right?
Trade-offs and rationing, right? Because, you know, one way that I think about it is it's all very well to say that we should get care when you're sick. Absolutely. Acute care in particular needs to be available for everybody without constraint. But when it comes to, I guess, other forms of care that are extremely expensive and will help only a few people, can we really afford it if we have a country that doesn't pay enough taxes? The answer is no. There has to be some form of rationing. Is it fair? No, nothing in life is fair when you think about it like that. And there are some really difficult trade-offs. And I think they always turn up in the health system more than other places because we're all very emotional, right? I mean, you are extremely vulnerable when you are there with your parent or your child and you're in the hospital and they're extremely sick and you want to have everything available done for them. At that point in time, we want the best possible care for these people. But in the lead up to it, we also want the lowest taxes. And we grudge that these other people are getting the services, right? So how do you find a way forward in having these conversations, which is the reason why we pay taxes, the reason why we have a public health system is because it's a collective approach to dealing with individual problems. That's really what it is, right? Fundamentally, the health issue that you have is a very individual, very personal, and very traumatic experience. But the reason you're able to go to the hospital and get that care is because you and many other people like you chose to pay taxes. And we use those taxes wisely in a way that allowed us to have the services that you want. It's not going to be everything. It can't be, right?
Well, I mean, I just saw an article in the New York Times very recently, and it was about this new treatment for sickle cell anemia. We have a few people in New Zealand who have it, but it's more common in America and probably more common in Africa, and probably more common in America as well, with the black population there. So I saw there's this new treatment for it, and it's a very debilitating illness. It can cause a lot of pain, a lot of harm to people's organs. And there's this new treatment, this new gene therapy, but it costs $2 to $3 million US. And that's just the cost of the treatment of the stem cells for the gene therapy. That's not including the actual irradiation, the medications, the 1 month long stay post bone marrow transplant. I don't know that we are paying. I don't think we'll ever be able to pay enough taxes to be able to afford this treatment. But I think part of the problem is that if somebody in New Zealand has sickle cell anemia and they see that there's this treatment available, it feels really unfair that other people somewhere else who look like them, who live a life similar to them, gets that treatment, but not here in New Zealand. And I find that really hard to reconcile.
It is really hard. And it's the brutal nature of this is at the very sharp end of this trade-offs that we're talking about is what can you give? So, do you spend $3 million on helping one individual live a much better life? Or do you spend that on, 10,000 people living a much better life? And those are unfortunately the kinds of trade-offs you always have to make. And in fact, we make them every single day.
Because in the healthcare system, it's like, the way I see it is $1 billion spent somewhere is $1 billion not spent elsewhere. And we can talk about, increasing the pot of money into the healthcare sector. But again, if that's another $1 billion spent in health, that's $1 billion not spent in education or the environment or transport or social welfare, housing, all these other things.
There are always trade-offs, right? There are always trade-offs. And I think we should not kid ourselves that we can spend our way out of this, that there will always be some form of rationing that takes place. And not all of it will feel fair because it's not. But
how do we say that these are the problems that we sacrifice, or these are, I guess, when it comes down to it, are you saying that there are some people and their lives and their quality of life that we need to sacrifice? Because that's kind of what we're saying, right, is that we can't save everyone.
We can't, and it's not physically possible, right? It's just not possible because we will never, ever pay enough taxes to do that, or we will never have everybody with sufficient private health insurance to pay for that, or whatever it is. The reality is there will be lots of reasons why some people can't, or whatever.
But I guess the thing is, if we don't pay for it, we definitely can't have it.
Yeah, and I think there will always be some form of rationing, but it's a question of where does the rationing kick in? Is it two people getting that type of very expensive but successful treatment, or is it 20 people? So sometimes the trade-offs are between 2 people or 20 people or no people in New Zealand. But in health, it's also the trade-offs within it, right? It's like we were saying right at the beginning, the trade-off is between, do we deal with the people who present with the problems today, or do we choose to put some of that money into the preventative public health elements, like nutrition, like smoking cessation, like reducing drug harm and alcohol harm? Do we put more effort into sport and physical activity? Because all of those things also have net effect over time, positive effects over time. And
because these are the conversations that have to happen, for example, in Treasury, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of
those are
Revenue.
The trade-offs. Those are the trade-offs, right? Fundamentally, those are the trade-offs. But the trade-offs are quite often in sharper relief when you talk about, $1 billion in health is $1 billion not in education, right? So my kids are not being taught, or you're getting treated. But what about the fact that it's $1 billion between, my kids being sick versus $1 billion in something else today? It's all of those things, right? And so quite often I think the time dimension goes away. The way that I think about it is quite often we look at where we spend money based on where we are today. We go, if I spend $1 today, will I be better off or worse off? Rather than asking, if we spend $1 today, will New Zealand be a better off country in 30 years' time or a worse country in 30 years' time? That future generation is in fact missing in these conversations. And that's quite problematic because that's part of the reason why public health is something that's quite often relegated, because it is an investment in the future. And so it's a very selfish way for us to kind of prioritize spending and talk about money, talk about policies or what we do or don't do, because it's just easier.
So I think about, I'm 30, so hopefully I'll be retiring in about 30 years, maybe. So selfishly, I'm thinking about what's it going to be like when I retire, and I'm going to do my best to look after myself. But, in the chance that I end up with a stroke or I end up with a heart attack and I need to go into care, how sustainable is our older aged, care system at the moment?
Well, I think it's under increasing pressure. And when you look forward 30 years, it looks even less sustainable because our older generations are going to be sicker than the current older generation. So what you can see...
Is that just because but do you think that's just because they're going to be more of them and they're going to live longer and just age
just
is
the rates too. So if you were born, say, the greatest generation, they were likely to be quite sick because they had poor nutrition. They went through a lot of really terrible stuff, right? So they actually had a lot of diseases, and quite often the medical technology was not available to deal with it. But pretty much every generation that was born after that was getting healthier and healthier until the ones that were born around 1980s. So those generations have started to become less healthy for a bunch of various reasons. But essentially, we are that long improvement of every cohort being better off than the parents is not true. So it may be that you individually are healthier, but what if your cohort or the other people who are going to require services are sicker? So more people are presenting, not because you are unhealthy, but because the wider population is unhealthier, right? And I think to me, that's the bigger risk. Is if I think about looking back from 30 years to today, I think the biggest risk for me is we can see the rising trends of things like diabetes and CVD, cardiovascular diseases, amongst relatively younger people. So generationally, we've got younger generations today that are sicker than they should be. And also, I mentioned mental health before. It's a big one for me because mental health is related to all of this stuff. Is every generation has been getting more anxious and more, depressed than in previous generations. Over
100%.
time.
I mean, all the studies are showing that at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, I look at the New Zealand Health Survey, which is a fabulous resource, and you can track it by generation that in every age group we're getting worse off, but also that the stresses of life are much greater amongst older age groups. So, there is a lot of other things going on in terms of loneliness, in terms of financial pressures, all those other bits and pieces. So you've got this kind of physical health and mental health coming together of this pressure that's going to come to, I guess, the health system over time. And when you get sick, you're going to be competing against a lot of other people because they've been sicker for longer.
And that's the thing. So in the emergency department, right, we have this triage system where triage 1 is like, this is an absolute emergency, all the way down to triage 5, which is like, oh, this can wait. But in the past, a triage 5 might be seen in 3 or 4 hours. Now, if you're triage 5, you might not get seen for 10, 12, 14 hours, right? And this is the idea is that the system only works if there's enough people in it, because it's all well and good to be like, okay, well, we're very good at treating the triage 1s and the triage 2s within the time frame. But the thing is that the triage 3s and 4s who are waiting a while, well, they can actually get more unwell just while they're waiting. So that triage 3 or 4 might become a triage 1. And we saw that, right? We saw that in Rotorua ED not that long ago. We had someone waiting in the emergency department. I don't know what their triage category is. I don't know what the details are, but they just collapsed in the waiting room. Presumably, if they're in the waiting room, it's triage 4 or 5. So that's probably going to happen more often, and that's what I'm really worried about.
It's the rationing that I was talking about. Unfortunately, when you don't have enough resources relative to demand, you have to ration, right? It's a choice. It's a choice that we make every single day. How many doctors do we have? How many hospital nurses do we have? How many hospitals we have? All of these things are actual choices, rational choices that we make with rational consequences. And I use the word rational because I think it is actually a choice that has been made. We chose not to have the investment in public health many decades ago. And today we choose not to have enough resources and capacity to deal with the demand that's presenting itself. These are rational choices, right? So we should not be surprised when there is rationing that happens as a consequence.
Let's talk about education, right? Because you can't really talk about the economy without talking about the workforce, and you can't talk about the workforce without talking about education. You were saying that you're on the board at a local primary school. So what have you noticed in the education? So you talked before about anxiety. When I looked into the numbers, last year, I was like, oh, geez, the rates of anxiety and depression in young people, and especially young women, this is before COVID, was sort of doubling every 2 or 3 years. And I just thought, this
scary.
is not to do with COVID. Everyone wants to blame everything on COVID. I'm like, no. This has been happening since way before. And it correlates with what I was noticing in the emergency department. Just as, N of one as one doctor, this is what I was noticing.
Sure.
Severe eating disorders, people coming in with intentional overdose. This is a problem that's just going to continue snowballing. But what have you noticed in your work in a primary school?
So in primary school, I mean, there are, in fact, lots of good things going on. A lot of the children are actually very healthy, very happy. They're doing all the good things. They're making progress, all those things, right? And so by and large, I think I'd say a vast majority of children doing fine. But there is a tail of children that has quite severe problems and like really worrying things that a child shouldn't have to experience. And talking to the teachers who've been around for a long time, a lot of the behaviors that they're dealing with today was extremely rare not that long ago. A lot of the challenges that they're facing are extremely rare, used to be extremely rare and now becoming more common. And so they're finding it really hard to respond to how do we look after these children, because we have a duty of care to look after these children, but you can only look after them while they're in your school. What happens outside of that school environment is very hard to tell, right? And whether it's in the family or whether it's the workplace or in the wider community, there's so many pressures, right? We talked about not just the rising kind of mental health issues that we're noticing amongst younger people, particularly young women, but across adults too. So society as a whole is getting more anxious.
What I do notice is a lot of kids come in with sort of what we call physical symptoms related to mental health stuff.
Sure.
So a lot of kids coming in with chronic abdominal pain or constipation, and I would say more often than not, when I ask the parents individually, is there something on? Is there something going on at home, And often parents say, oh, we're going through separation or divorce, but the children don't know. Well, we're handling it really well. And you go,
the kid's not taking it so well.
Yeah, the child's not taking it so well. Or the fact that, children are these sort of empathetic sponges. They just take in everything that's going on. And, sometimes they don't really know how to handle these emotions. They don't have an outlet, and it sort of manifests in these physical symptoms.
Sure. And we have experienced that at our school. It's really hard, right? Because you're unprepared for it. The resources don't keep up, the knowledge doesn't keep up, the ways you respond to it doesn't keep up, and certainly the funding doesn't keep up, right? So, what I've noticed is, when we have children that we really want to look after, the more high needs students, really, really hard to find the qualified, trained people and the funding from the Ministry of Education to be able to pay for these people to look after these kids.
I was reading this article, and it was saying how a lot of teachers these days are saying that there's a lot of kids coming to school not toilet trained, or not toilet trained in poos or wees basically, and needing their nappies changed all the time. A lot of behavioural problems, and these are teachers, like you say, who've been working for decades, perhaps.
Totally.
And this is a new phenomena it can't be related to genetics, because genetics doesn't change that quickly, right? So it must be some sort of social, cultural change that is going on.
Quite possibly. And also just, parents are so busy.
Yeah.
Everybody's working double jobs, triple jobs, whatever it is, double income families. So the reality is that, people are finding it difficult.
And what are those wider impacts, right? Like,
well, if a child
everyone's working way more, right?
Well, we are busier and poorer, right? It's the ultimate irony. Is like you're working longer hours, working more jobs, but families don't feel like they're getting ahead, right? And that's a horrible feeling to be in, because you feel like you're doing everything that you can do your family, but then you're not able to provide to the extent or level you want to, right? And so there is this kind of loss of dignity when that happens. And that's partly, I think, the anxiety that people face is they can't actually live the life that they would like to live, or they think that they should live. And that's quite debilitating. We've seen it I can see it in the data, for example, that fewer households are buying fruit and vegetables and meat, and just the things that kind of tell you that I'm looking after myself and my family well. And people are having to go without, right, in a way that we have never seen in New Zealand in the data that I have. Even going back to, say, the 1980s, 90% of households would be buying vegetables in a given week, and now it's 60%.
60%?
Yeah.
So we're saying 40% of families are not accessing
in that particular week, right? So they might have bought it the other week, but still, it's kind of like it's the norms are changing, and the things that people are sacrificing on are changing, and people are cutting basics. That takes away a lot of that, I guess, dignity. I mean, going back to our sort of your question, the long-term effects are, of course, it's everybody's just a little bit more strung out, right? And everybody's just feeling more stressed, and we've got children who are less prepared to learn, who are less prepared to engage. And so, what I was giving a talk to the early childhood and kindergarten folk recently, and I said, one of the kind of the big benefits of early childhood and kindergartens is that, it's not necessarily about the education per se, right? It's about learning how to be with other children.
The socialization.
The social part, the emotional part. Those are actually really powerful things that early childhood education and kindergartens do. But it doesn't always happen. Right. And so that's what we are observing is we are getting children who are coming into school who haven't got this basic skills that let them kind of be part of the school environment and take advantage of, I guess, the opportunities that are there, whether it's in terms of play or learning. Right. And so it means that there will be some groups of our society who are going to fall further behind from the get-go.
Well, I mean, we're seeing a lot of research out there about school attendance, right? School attendance not being great, especially in the sort of the high school area, right? Does it concern you about the poor school attendance rates and future economic sustainability?
Absolutely. I mean, I probably start from an individual perspective and then scale it up to the economy-wide perspective. We know that schooling makes a huge difference, right? And it's actually it's learning how to learn, being able to having the basics in terms of numeracy, literacy, and those kinds of things, but also being able to ask questions, being able to learn from seeing things around you, new information being presented to you. That learning to learn part is actually super critical. And if you don't pick those skills up by the time you've left school, particularly high school, how are you going to get on in life, right? Whether it's in any kind of work or in social interactions, those are actually really critical skills. So I worry a lot from an individual perspective that there are children who are going to become less well adjusted to be able to just participate in society. And that worries me. And from an economic perspective, absolutely. If you don't have numeracy skills, if you don't have literacy skills, if you don't have social and emotional skills, then you will not be able to work. You will not be able to progress. You will not be able to be the best that your ability gives you the potential for. So there is this kind of this unnecessary crisis.
And what do you think about, I mean, that's one of the ingredients into this crisis, right, is less people finishing education or having a good amount of education, right? And then there's also the other part, which is that a lot of people my age who are, well qualified, engineers, doctors, whatever, leaving. So if we have all of those people leaving and then not very many people staying, and the ones who are staying perhaps not so highly skilled, what is that a recipe for?
Yeah, look, I think we do lose some people with good education in New Zealand, but we don't lose most of them. So I don't think we should overplay that. You are still here, Nina.
Yeah, I'm still here. That's true.
So I guess what I'm saying is
it's all you.
Yeah, so a bit of context. I think it's true that lots of people do leave. But when you look at people who emigrate from New Zealand, so two parts to this, right? One is, do we have enough people? And then brain drain, I guess. So when you look at the number of people who leave from New Zealand, so particularly to Australia, because that's where most people go, it's across all kinds of qualifications and jobs. Everything from people who are working in retail and hospo to people who are doctors and lawyers and whatever. So it's actually a whole range of people. We're not losing just highly qualified people. We're just losing
everyone.
A cross-section, yeah. And so there is a wider issue there, right? It's not necessarily that we want to stop people from going, because sometimes it's the right thing to do for that individual.
And sometimes they bring skills and experience back.
Totally. And they might already have family there, and there might be a whole bunch of different reasons. And it's okay, right? I don't want to limit people's choices. But the national conversation should be, have we given them enough choices here? for them to stay should they choose to. And I think that's a conversation we should have, right? That's the wider conversation. It's not so much we have to stop them from leaving. It should be we have given them an offer they can't refuse, right? That it's such a great place to live, that's why you don't want to leave. The other part is around, I guess, on the immigration side, we actually import people with qualifications, right? So that's New Zealand's trick. We import a lot of people that are highly qualified. I mean, sure, they mainly drive Ubers, right? But, we waste a lot of their talent, right? And we're not the only ones. The same happens in the US, in Europe, in the UK, where we import a lot of people saying, you can come in if you have these qualifications. But once you come in, quite often those qualifications can't be transferred.
Jack. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you are unable to kind of fulfill your potential of the education that you have. And a very long-winded answer to your question, but I think there's a bigger issue in terms of, is education and higher education in particular all it's cracked up to be?
Right. What makes you say that?
Well, the returns to education, we're improving for a long time. So, particularly for our parents' generation, being educated, particularly tertiary education, was a ticket to middle-class success. It was a ticket, right? And we could see that in the data. So the difference of income between people with high school only and people with tertiary education, the income difference was around 50%, right? Quite a big leap in incomes. So even though you were sacrificing some early years of your life in studying more, you could expect to earn more through your lifetime. That premium, that kind of return to education has been shrinking over time. So these days it's much, much smaller.
Why do you think that's happening?
Partly because so many more of us have education. It's no longer scarce. So it's not so
there was
much
an exclusivity, elitism with the idea of having a university degree.
There was also an unmet need for
Right.
those qualifications and not that knowledge, that way of working that was missing in the workforce. So we kind of, it's not surprising, right? Because tertiary education really took off in a big way when we kind of democratized it and opened it up to the wider masses. And for the first few cohorts, absolutely, first few generations, absolutely, the returns were spectacular. But the education in more recent decades, I think, hasn't delivered the same kinds of returns. And what we're seeing now is you can have a degree, but that's not a guaranteed success of you landing a job in that area of your qualification or getting a significant premium in terms of incomes.
I mean, to me, we talked about being a Ponzi scheme. I'm worried that universities have become the next Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, I think some of it is. I think some of it is, the kind of the fast food kind of version of education. So some of it is churn and burn, and you come in and you get a degree, but the degree doesn't necessarily give you a career pathway or that ability to get a significant premium in terms of incomes, and certainly not enough to compensate you for the cost of higher education. So I think there is a challenge there. We've kind of pursued education with the idea, I think with the right idea, that it'll set you up for success. And it worked for a while, but I don't think it's working as well as it could be. But there's still a lot of people who are doing things that requires formal education, right? I mean, I wouldn't want a doctor who doesn't have a formal qualification.
Well, that's controversial because some people would prefer to see a naturopath or something. But anyway, that's by the by.
Let's put that to the side just for now. But I guess all I'm saying is I think there are certain things where they're just technical skills that are required for that formal education is really, really important. But I think the education sector has to grow up a lot and change a lot because the types of qualifications that we need in society and in workplaces of the future are going to be different. And that kind of one and done at the beginning of your life when you're 18, when you have no freaking idea what you're going to do with the rest of your life, you're going to get a degree and that's going to set you up for life. I don't think that's going to work anymore. So I suspect lifetime learning, more micro-credentialing, more kind of being able to chop and change, those kinds of things will become the ways of education in the future. But like anything, whether it's in public health, in tax systems or whatever, the reality is these changes are quite difficult to do. They're slow to move, right? And the education system is exactly like that. It's very stuck in the way that it does things now. It's not moving fast enough. But yeah, I do worry that there'll be kids who are graduating today that are no more likely to get a job than if they had gone to vocational training. In fact, they might have been better off getting vocational training.
Well, I mean, some people argue that doing a trade has a better financial security than working in health. You know, the people
Quite
complain
often.
about seeing their GP and paying the $50, $60. But, you know, if your pipe bursts and you need to call a plumber, you just got to pay the plumber, right?
Absolutely. And there is no shame in working in trade jobs. They are important jobs that create good work, valuable work that we want. And it can be good pathways to not only having a job and through a income, but quite often these people will turn into small business people, and those businesses might get bigger. So there are multiple different pathways that are open from these other ways of doing things. But also, just think about what gives you joy in your day. Is it seeing the doctor, or is it going to the cafe and having your coffee? And there's the barista actually creates a lot more joy in some people's lives than other professions. So,
what was I thinking when I was 17 and chose medicine?
But unfortunately, of course, as a barista, you don't get paid very well. So there are, there are trade-offs here, and they're hard trade-offs, because quite often the things that are important are not necessarily well paid, and they're not necessarily connected to education. So it's a bit of a mess. I think those rules of thumb that go and get an education, in tertiary education in particular, and you're going to be set for life, I don't think is necessarily true.
I don't think I agree. I don't think it's true at all. I mean, some people get a bachelor's degree and then they're like, oh, I can't get a job, I have to get a master's, and oh, I can't get a job, I have to get a PhD, and oh, I can't get a job, so I guess I'll just lecture in the thing that I've done a PhD in. And then you go, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem sustainable at all. And I do worry about this idea that a tertiary education is always better than, going into the trades. I think people sometimes feel offended if a school suggests, oh, go, have you thought about like trades or something? But they're incredibly valued in society, right?
Extremely important.
We need plumbers, we need electricians, we need builders, we need, and the idea of professions like teaching and nursing, they used to be sort of a trade in a way, in the sense that it was all on the job sort of learning. It's more of an apprenticeship kind of model.
Sure.
And a lot of those have been brought into universities and made into sort of academic qualifications. But I think it's, for one thing, we're not paying them anymore, because teachers or nurses used to be paid on the job as they were learning. And now they have to pay to learn, and also they're getting a lot less practical time in a job that is very practical. And of course, there's theoretical parts in terms of how that needs to be learned. But I guess I wonder that this whole idea that if we just make everything tertiary education, academic qualification, we'll all be better off. And I don't think that's true.
No, I don't think it's true. I mean, it's again going back to that and. In everything in life is about and. You need some people who are, qualified, deeply qualified in particular things. We do need those PhDs who are working on really big science, big brain problems. And I love those people. They're wonderful. But doesn't mean we should not have people who are doing trades or people who are becoming other things. I did a piece of work for UCall some years ago, and, it was pretty clear that if you were in trades and you took on some of those additional little micro courses around things like, bookkeeping and accounting and management and leadership, they actually created real value for your business. So quite often it's a mix and match of the kinds of skills you need to unlock potential. So there is value in education.
So when you're talking about value, you're saying, if I spend X amount of money on this course, will it increase my income by...
Will it increase my income, or will I be a better boss, or will I be will I have a better workplace? All of those things are important, right? I mean, one of the things that I have observed, and it's seen in the data, is businesses that have good culture and good leadership are way more productive in terms of having higher paid workers and having more profitable businesses. So, it doesn't just have to be feel good. It can actually have a monetary return as well, but it doesn't have to be just that, right? So education, I think, to me it's one of those things. It's, of course, as a nerd, like, to me, education is really important, right? Like, I learned a lot, and I'm constantly learning. I love the learning part of it because that's fun. It's not true for everybody, but we're all learning in different ways. And it's okay to respect that people have different ways of learning, and that allows them to realize their potential. One of my mates, his son became a builder, and he's so happy. He wants to work outdoors. He's got a really practical mind, and he's quite good at maths, but didn't want to pursue maths. But actually use a hell of a lot of maths when you're building a house, right? So it's a really great outcome to take this mix and match of these different kind of things that make somebody happy, and finding a profession that really kind of brings it out of them.
Do you think we're at risk of producing a university industrial complex, right, where we sort of focus on quantity rather than quality? If we get more people through, then as a society we're going to be richer instead of being like, maybe we should focus on quality.
I think we're doing a bit of that. I think we sacrificed our vocational education in preference for tertiary education.
Because, that's how kind of universities are funded. They're more funded on how many people can they get through the course.
Bums on seats, absolutely.
Bums on seats. And how many people can they pass as well? Because I believe that is part of the thing, is if people don't pass, they don't get as much funding.
Yeah, so look, I think we are seeing that now. And I think that's why we're seeing people coming through with tertiary education qualifications, but they're not necessarily getting a premium in their incomes, nor are they working in the areas where their qualification is.
There's some AUT summer school course on Taylor Swift studies.
That kind of sounds fun, to be fair.
Which it does sound fun. And we debated it in this household a little bit, because I'm like, she's very successful. What's the problem with studying her success and how she's gotten there? Because, for example, William Shakespeare was very influential in his time and also in the time gone by, right? At some point, somebody was probably like, should we introduce Shakespearean studies to university? And probably at the time there may have been people who'd be like, why would you do that? Blah, 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 blah. He's just a playwright. This isn't real science or real university qualifications. So, who are we to say that Taylor Swift studies shouldn't be taught at a tertiary level?
Yeah, well, and I think also, but in tertiary, I think there's two types of learning that happens. There's the technical learning, like, in medicine, you learn a lot of stuff around anatomy and all that kind of stuff. Really important, right? But there's also an element of learning that happens in tertiary education. It's about learning to learn. It's how do you think about things? How do you unpack a problem? How do you deal with an issue, right? So that learning to learn part can happen in almost any type of discipline. And so whether you do it through studying Shakespeare or Taylor Swift, I don't actually have a problem with. That's okay. As long as you're getting some generalized skills that give you the ability to learn, to communicate, to break down complexity and apply it in other ways, whatever it is. There are actually lots of other things that university education does. So I don't want to be too negative on tertiary education.
Because I feel like a lot of people, because, universities are having to cut down courses, or they're saying they're having to cut down courses. And I think the people who, or like the faculties that probably feel most attacked, I guess, is sort of the arts.
Which is ironic, right? Because like I said, I think to me there are two parts of learning in tertiary, which is around the technical skills and almost the thinking skills, the learning to learn skills. The technical skills are fine because I think you got to have the stems, fine. But actually the creative thinking and the arts, the philosophy, those kinds of areas are where you learn to kind of grapple with things that are difficult and complex and don't have simple answers. And I think that's one of the big problems. I think the problem with having very well-educated people quite often is that they'll go, there is a technical solution to this problem. Life is not like that.
There's a lot of grey area.
It is all grey. It's all shades of grey. It is all grey. And so this is, in fact, something that I experience in public policy all the time when we're creating advice. It's like, give me the answer to this problem. And my sort of pushback always is that problem is going to morph in 12 months' time to something else. And the solution that you designed perfectly today will not work in 12 months' time. So how have we thought about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? And how have we built in that flexibility and that learning by doing, that sense of experimentation and learning from failure that's baked into this? So quite often, what we want to do is we want to learn from doing things, right? You have to have a logical reason for thinking about how do I deal with something? Very good. But then you can't say that's the end. It's constant, right? You have to constantly learn, constantly evolve. And quite often, people who are very technical in nature, engineers in particular, are like that. They're quite often there is a problem, here is a design that I'll put in place, and it will be solved. In a technical setting, it might be. In an engineering context, it might be the case. But in a social, human, economic context, that would never work.
I think now more than ever, we need to be making sure that we've got things in the arts sector right. Because this is what I'm talking about is like humanities, right?
Totally. And humanities are extremely powerful because that's where you learn to think. I mean, I love listening to philosophy podcasts because it makes you think in a different way. Because we've got huge
problems coming. And I think we don't necessarily, because we all technical. I don't know if we've prepared people enough for having these really hard conversations in the grey area.
Yeah. I mean, but let's just to push back a little bit, yes, we have problems coming, but we also have lots of reasons to be optimistic. Life is a lot better in a lot of different ways, right? A lot of us are living longer. We have better access to healthcare.
But you
We
just
have
told
better
me that we're
medicines.
going to be less healthy than previous generations.
It's the distribution. It's the distribution problem, isn't it? Some of us, it's the long tail. So whether it's in education or health, what we're seeing is that there's probably 60, 70, 80% of us that are going to be amazing. But there is 20% or 30% that are doing really badly. And so to me, that's the challenge. It's not that all of us are experiencing this. There's this growing tail of people that are doing much worse. But there's also a bunch of us that are doing really well. And we should celebrate the success, but we should not be blinded by the success to not deal with the problems that are also coming and are completely predictable and completely visible.
Well, because I want to ask you about your predictions for the future, right? So I was doing some Googling of you to, prepare for this. And I saw you did this video series with a spin-off in 2016 or 2017. And I thought they were so funny. Everyone should Google it. It was called Hey Shamubeel. It was very zany, very cute. I loved it. And I think it was 2016 or 2017.
10 years ago, yeah.
You were you're pretty optimistic at that point. You're very optimistic that the technological changes that by and large in the past things have been really positive overall, net positive. Since 2016, obviously we've talked. AI has come into the picture. Sure. People are thinking that's going to replace a lot of humans in their jobs. It's going to change how we do things a lot, I think, in the next couple of decades. Are you still as optimistic about the future?
Absolutely. I think it has the potential to be very positive. The reality is that New Zealand humans have actually done a very good job of harnessing technology for benefit, but sometimes we haven't had the social and political infrastructure to make sure that benefit is widely shared.
Do we have that now?
Well, I don't think we do. I think to me that's probably the biggest concern right now is not so much that the technology is the thing that's going to eat us, but it's the inability for us to work together as society to make sure those benefits are widely shared and the problems.
Okay, but if you had to bet money, you're saying that it would work if we had the political social structures in place.
I think it will still work, but I think it's going to benefit the few, not the many. And this is always the case. I think when new technologies come, there's always been new technologies. And I've been working for 20 plus years now, and it dates me a little bit. But the funny thing is, like, every time these new things come in, it's going to be terrible. And then 10 years later, nobody even remembers what the technology was, right? It kind of becomes part and parcel of it. The internet was meant to be this huge thing. It's a thing, but it's not a huge thing, right? I mean, it's become it's like infrastructure, it's like roads, right? The internet has become like a road. It's just basic infrastructure that people expect to have, but it's not something life-changing in the way that people had catastrophized about in that early period. So I think in many ways, I still hold a real sense of optimism that technological progress will have lots of many good things to have. Your example of the sickle cell anemia treatment, how extraordinary, right? How extraordinary that we've got the science to be able to deal with this problem, right? Amazing. And I can confidently predict within 20 years' time, it's not going to cost $3 million to treat a person with that. It will be just as normal as many other types of treatments, right? So because technological progress, that's how it works. Do I have some concerns? The answer is yes, I do have some concerns. And my biggest concern is not around technology or these external things, but around social cohesion. And the reason I say that is when you think about big changes, political policy changes we've made in our history, they've kind of been done on the back of being able to hold a consensus. So Second World War was I think a real kind of line in the sand for that generation, the greatest generation. They built the welfare state on the back of that, thinking we never want to experience the horrors of war like this again. And that kind of sustained us pretty much through the 60s and 70s, right? And then we had Muldoon and he wrecked everything. And then we had the reforms of the 1980s and the baby boomers carried that change through. And we've kind of sustained that until today. But they were the majority of voters. But there is no real majority of voters anymore. There is no center. And I feel like New Zealand is fragmenting. And I think this is happening in other parts of the world as well. And what that means is that I think it's harder for us to build consensus and hold a line across society for a long period of time. So if we want to have political and social settings that are able to deal with these kind of quite rapid changes, right? So things like artificial intelligence, automation, social media, these are kind of big changes that are happening in a very short period of time. They're sped up change. For that, you need kind of social consensus, you need social agreement, not necessarily consensus, but
I mean, this is
broad
why I
agreement.
was talking about, the humanities, that I think we need stronger focus on humanities because we need to study how these effects, what effects these will have socially.
But also, how do we talk to each other, not seeing you as a doctor, but you as a human first, right? Being able to connect on a more kind of common denominator of humanity, of being able to see other people for their true kind of worth. And I do struggle that I think at the moment those divisions are opening up. I think I see a real escalation of racism in this country, which is very worrying for me because I think a lot of New Zealand was improving for a long period of time. I think
I definitely felt it was things were getting better, So I think you also kind of grew up in a kind of semi-rural place, right? Like I grew up in Wookworth, a semi-rural place, and I definitely experienced some, explicit racism just walking down the street, that kind of thing. But when I, became an adult, I felt like things were getting better. I even felt like, it's actually it's kind of trendy to be Asian now, all this like K-pop stuff. It's like kind of trendy. But then you hear about all those reports of, Asian people just being, punched on the street. I've seen it in the emergency department. And that's not to say, non-Asian people are not being assaulted on the street as well. This is probably a widespread issue. But I do worry, especially with growing geopolitical tensions about the effects of me looking the way that I look living in this country. I do think about things like, during World War II and the internment camps in the US for Japanese people. I'm like, oh God, are we only a stone's throw away from that, in the future?
And let's not forget the fairly overt racism that happens against Maori and Pacifica people in this country. So, absolutely. And to me, those things are concerns because essentially we're seeing this fragmentation of society into these different identities, whether it's your ethnicity, whether it's rural or urban, whether it's, your professional versus working class or tradie, whatever. These are kind of unhealthy breakdowns of society, these unhealthy divisions in society. And, the more of this kind of this social cohesion that comes under pressure, the more difficult it is to deal with these kind of the big issues that come at us, because division is easy to kind of use and leverage when you want to kind of use new things, new technologies, power to your advantage. So, look, I retain a sense of optimism from the sense that I think there's enough good stuff going on that if we want to, we can make them actually work for society. The biggest concern and the biggest risk for me, I think, is not whether those tools will be available. It's whether or not we'll be able to wield the tools for long enough in an enduring way to make changes that are useful. And that is a concern because I feel like there's a few things that are going on that's we're running out of runway a little bit. So our aging population is one. I think climate change is another. I think race relations is another. Those kind of three things are coming at us all at the same time that can create this kind of quite an unhealthy, difficult environment for us to find common ground to build a coalition around.
I want to throw a little spanner in the works. We talked a little bit about immigration before. And I think a lot of people are talking about it in, say, the US and the UK about the effects of immigration.
Sure, and Canada.
And Canada, yeah. So basically the Western Hemisphere, right? So I guess one of the concerns is because of the, divisiveness in the New Zealand community as it stands. I don't know that we have this cohesive identity of what a New Zealander is or what we believe in together as a community. And I guess I wonder if with this aging population and this dependence on immigration coming through to, service as a working age population, do we risk, because we don't know who we are, significantly changing who we are if we don't even know who we are as a country?
Yeah, I think it's a real risk.
I'm asking you this, knowing that we are both immigrants.
Right. I was going to say, the irony is not lost on me.
Because I guess the question is, it's not that immigration is good or bad, it's the rate of change and who we are as a nation, I guess.
It's a few different things, right? So one is New Zealand doesn't have a strong reason for why we have immigration. No one has ever truly articulated to me why we have immigration in New Zealand. What is the purpose? So if you don't know why, then all the other conversations after that are based on speculation. And so quite quickly, conversations around immigration will turn into racism because we haven't actually started with a common understanding of we have immigration because we want to have a bigger population, or because we want to have a more diverse population, or because we want to import workers, or because we want to import qualifications, whatever. It is not explicit in terms of why we have immigration in New Zealand that's shared as a reason across New Zealand. And I think it will become a bit of a challenge for a couple of things. One is around, I think, the very rapid pace of change. So it hasn't been that big a problem in New Zealand until recently. So if you look at the contribution of net migration to population growth, it hadn't been that big until the last decade. So until recently, we still had natural population growth because we're still having babies, right? We're not really having babies that much anymore. So all of a sudden, we've kind of gone from immigration is about half of our population growth to now becoming pretty much the majority of our population growth. And it makes places like Auckland look really different, right? So in Auckland, more than half of the population is now going to be of non-Pākehā ethnicities. And if you look at our country going forward, it's going to look different across age composition or an ethnic composition, and it's going to look wildly different in different parts of New Zealand. And so immigration is kind of going to... It has the risk of becoming this thing that, it becomes a scapegoat. And that's what's happening particularly in Canada. I look at Canada because Canada was an interesting country. They really had quite good immigration policy and pretty good societal kind of buy-in around the idea of immigration, because they had this very strong kind of story around multiculturalism as a thing for Canada. But even in Canada, that road has run out.
How so?
Well, Trudeau pretty much said we're not going to have immigration in the same rates as we've had recently. And so,
but what are the problems? Like, why is that, I guess,
why is it becoming a problem? Yeah, so the problem, of course, is the same as we have here, which is when you have lots of population growth without increases in the capacity, the social and physical infrastructure capacity, whether it's the road, bridges, hospital, nurses, whatever. When those things don't keep up, then it's the people who are there that see the kind of the negative consequences of growth, right? It's like all of a sudden there's not enough homes, my roads are too congested, there's too many people waiting in ED. Those things are really problematic when it's on the back of population growth that's too fast for the system to keep up with, or because you chose not to keep up with it. And in fact, those are the choices, again, the rationing that we make all the time, right? So New Zealand is a relatively rich country, but we chose not to invest in our infrastructure for many decades. And that's why we have so much congestion in places like Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch, which we don't have to, but we chose to.
I guess the other thing that I want to bring up that I have concerns about. So my parents moved to New Zealand, I think, early 90s, right? I was born in New Zealand in 94. And because there were so few migrants, I just had to, assimilate, right? Which, causes a little bit of, trauma in me at the moment, right? Disconnect with my own ethnic identity, all that kind of stuff. Sure. That's a separate story. And I guess, because I grew up in that environment, I had to learn about the treaty, like in school, sure. Right? And I guess part of me is a little bit concerned that the type of people coming through, and I'm talking about it as a Chinese person, right? I look at a lot of newer Chinese immigrants who come in flush with cash. My parents, it's a very different story. My parents came with very little money, and this new kind of age of immigrants, a lot of people who are coming in with lots of money, starting businesses here, different studying, reasons, all this kind of thing, different reasons. And I do get the feeling that overall, we're not very good at integrating immigrants wherever you come from. My example would be, we get a lot of English doctors coming here and we don't give them very good education about the social context in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. A lot of them come here and they have no idea that we've got such high rates of rheumatic fever in children, for an example, right?
Which is shocking, right?
Which is shocking. So I think we do a we do a terrible job of actually helping any immigrants from anywhere integrate into New Zealand and share what are our cultures, what are our values.
Yeah, and in fact, again, I sort of looked at Canada as something that they had been doing, and it was both about preparing their people, the population, so they had lots of citizens' assemblies, connections into local meetings, all that kind of stuff. It was very localized in terms of how many immigrants are targeted and how many people you want to come into community. So local communities had a lot of control over that. It worked until it didn't work. But also they had quite a lot around supporting people who are coming in to help kind of learn how to kind of fit in, not necessarily integrate, but I think fit into the local community. So assimilation is a difficult word, but I think integration is probably nicer. But you know what I mean, right? So to me, it's like there are ways of doing it that helps. So it reduces the culture shock, because that's what it is, right? It's culture shock. You are coming from a very different background and you're kind of transplanting your life quite often. And most immigrants in New Zealand are economic migrants, right? So people are coming at later ages. You and I are different. You were born here. I moved here when I was 13. So, I guess our experiences are quite different in some ways. Yours is very different to mine as well. But as a result, I think what happens is that what you were able to sort of accumulate in terms of your lived experience because you've had time versus you kind of coming in as a fairly fully formed adult, trying to kind of learn about things, is quite different.
Very different.
And I think it's less of an issue in places like Auckland because it's such a diverse community anyway. I think that probably happens a little bit more here, but it probably is much harder in other places. Taking your point that actually it still takes a lot of effort to learn about the treaty. It takes a lot of effort to understand the social context. It takes a lot of effort to kind of really engage with all those complexities of society that exist everywhere. But there's a distinct New Zealand flavor that you need to learn about. And yes, we should do more of that. And I think the integration part is a lot about that. It's about not just knowing the flag of New Zealand and learning how to sing the anthem, but about, thinking about the hopes and dreams and the culture and the cultural norms and practices, not because you should adopt them, but because you should understand them.
I mean, I think that's the idea of social cohesion, is that we can talk, to the ends of the world about, Crown Māori relations and Pākehā and Māori, but I think we also have to be talking about immigrants as well, like you and me.
Absolutely. And, the immigrant society, community in New Zealand is big and growing, right? And particularly in places like Auckland, very, very big. And so, but it is that thing, it's like, how do you do it in a way that's useful and effective? But it's like anything, right? We have to learn by doing. We have to just give it a go and try. I don't think we should have immigration just for the sake of having immigration. I think we should have a distinct reason. I think
what should that reason be?
I don't know what the reason is because, again, like I said, nobody has been able to tell me in New Zealand why we have immigration.
I mean, I thought it was to increase the GDP.
Maybe. Where is it written?
I don't know. It's a guess.
Yeah. So look, I think this is the thing, right? It doesn't mean the thing is wrong. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have it. But I think if we want to have New Zealanders on board to have immigration for whatever reason, we need to be really explicit that we're doing it for a purpose or a number of different reasons. So then we can go, yes, we can hold our public officials and our politicians to account and say, you said that was the reason you're bringing these people in. Have you done everything that's required of you to make that a success? Or are we having too many people relative to what you said you were doing it for? And at the moment, we're not able to have that kind of civil conversation about immigration because it's kind of this, well, I don't know why we have it. So how can I tell you what the right number is if I don't even know what the purpose is?
And I think part of it as well is it's really easy for us to have this conversation, but I think some people, let's say if you're a Pākehā person having this conversation, it's quite easy to fall in the trap of like, oh, this person's just a racist or whatever.
Well, and it's true. And I think that's the challenge is like, well, if we shut people out of these conversations, then it perpetuates the problem, right?
Because I had this conversation with my dad the other day about, am I failing my ethnic identity? Because, I wish my Chinese was a bit better. And he said, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. Couldn't care less. Your identity is that you're a New Zealander. You're a Kiwi first.
Well, it is, right? And I think, for migrants, I think it's always... I did a talk at a book festival in Tauranga, which was about, your kind of... the place that you call home. And I said, well, I call New Zealand home because that's where my family is, that's where my children are, that's where I feel most at peace, right? But there's always going to be a bit of me that's not really from here because I'm not really from here, right? I lived some of my life out of this country and a lot of my life here. And so are you truly part of this place? Maybe to a certain extent, and in other extents not. And it's okay to have that mixed feeling, right? And I think that's just a common feeling of migrants and migrant children all around the world. And I sort of think about what it's going to mean for my kids. They look very different from me, right? Because they're half Chinese, half Bangladeshi, and like, what's their identity?
I think about that because like, my future children are probably going to be, half Chinese, half like Scottish English. So I'm like, what's their identity going to be?
Yeah.
How does that go into the mix of this, ethnic, because I think with ethnicity, we sort of box people into these quite broad strokes.
It does. And it's really hard, right? Because more and more we're going to identify with different kind of priority ethnicities. And what does that even mean anymore? So ethnicity was a kind of, I think, a relatively easy way to kind of box things up in the past. It's going to get harder and harder as we become a much more, I think, a diverse community.
And mixed heritage, I think.
And mixed heritage as well. I mean, which has always been the case in New Zealand, but, it was kind of like, what's Pākehā in New Zealand? It's a mixture of lots of different things, right? And that's a good thing. In fact, there's a lot of strength in the diversity, right? So, there used to be a lot of racism against, I guess, the Dalmatians in New Zealand not that long ago. It's not really a thing anymore, right? Which is a good thing. So you kind of integrate because you see a difference until you don't see the difference. So immigrants, I think, will play a big role regardless because we're already here. And the conversation, I think, has to be had by us and with us, but with everybody else. If we, it can't be had in isolation. It's too big an issue, too important, and too big a part of our community, particularly our future society, to not have that conversation. But I don't know who's going to lead it.
Well, neither do I, but I will leave us with one last question as we contemplate that. So we talked about Taylor Swift before. I want to ask you, who is your favorite musical artist ever, and what's your favorite song?
Oh, that's a hard question. My most favorite song is probably Hallelujah, Jeff Buckley.
What do you love about that song?
Oh, it's magical. Glass of wine, listen to that at night, just beautiful.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been some really interesting conversations and a lot to think about. And I feel like I have more questions.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Revolving Door Syndrome acknowledges Māori as tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We recognise the inequities and challenges faced by Indigenous and vulnerable groups and acknowledge our duty to work towards closing the gap.